It might surprise you to know that there's this whole trend of taking R-rated franchises and making kids' cartoons out of them. One of the more famous examples was Rambo, which was this very violent film series that began as a film discussing the problems awaiting soldiers returning from Vietnam, and someone was like, that, but animated. But you'd also be surprised to know how many horror and horror-related films got their own cartoon runs. So, let's take this little trip down this road and check out how these things worked on the small screen in cell form. We're starting all the way back in 1966 with a classic cartoon called The King Kong Show, and you'll never guess what this one was based on. Well, if you said King Kong, well, you're right. I mean, that was probably easier than I thought, actually. This was a joint production between America and Japan and ran on ABC on Saturday mornings. It's said to be the first anime-based series that was done in Japan, made for an American company. It's rather different than the source material, as the Big Ape is shown to be much more of a purely heroic character and teams up with the Bond family, no relation to James, to go on adventures and fight crime. Sadly, it only lasted for one season, and there's only 25 episodes, as the ratings just didn't merit more. However, the collaboration between the companies inspired Rankin Bass, who had the rights to the property, to then loan them out to another Japanese company, Toho, who then made the set of films in which the character would exist within the Godzilla universe.
King Kong, you know the name of King Kong.
The next one came around a few years later, in 1970, and you might want to argue that King Kong is horror-related, but you can't say that about the groovy Ghoulies. This was about a trio that lived in a big old boarding house and were also sort of a pop band together. And oh yeah, they're also Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. This was by Filmation and was a Saturday morning show that ran on CBS, and the characters were all modeled after the Universal versions of the monsters and done in the wake of Scooby-Doo's success. Over the course of the series, they would have crossovers with characters from the Archie universe, as it was paired up with the Archie Show cartoon, and they would eventually appear in each other's things, particularly Sabrina the Teenage Witch. The shows would also feature a musical number, with the monsters singing and playing a song. It was not successful though, and only lasted one season with 16 episodes, but the Ghoulies would continue to appear in other shows, and in an anthology, which they repackaged previous episodes and added some live action elements as well.
'Cause it's time for the groovy Ghoulies show.
Well, 66 had King Kong, so it's only fair that another big boy got a chance, and in 1978 there was more kaiju action with Godzilla. This one was from Hanna-Barbera and ran on NBC in a show called the Godzilla Power Hour, where they would pair the Big G up with another show called Janna of the Jungle, but then later added Johnny Quest and changed the title to Godzilla Super 90. And then later the Godzilla Globetrotters Adventure Hour, and the Godzilla Dino Mutt Hour, and even the Godzilla Hong Kong Phooey Hour, although it should be pointed out that by that time the show was all reruns. In fact, even though the show ran in various forms through '81, it was only 2 seasons long, with a total of 26 episodes. Much like Kong, this version of the character was far more gentle and fought crime along with the crew of the Calico, a research ship that was always getting into trouble. It was mostly known for the invention of Godzuki, a wacky sidekick character that was a tiny version of the Big G that could only shoot out smoke rings. He was similar to Manila in principle, but executed in a different way and was human-sized. It also changed G's power so that instead of shooting radioactive breath, he only breathed fire. But he also had the added ability to fire lasers out of his eyes, like Godzilla does. It said that they originally wanted to make the character truer to his Japanese version, but standards and practices at the time didn't allow it, and any of the things that the big fella would normally be known for was verboten, so they had to alter the concept almost entirely.
Godzilla, 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 and Godzuki.
Our next entry came in 1980, and it's funny that it arrived so close to the Ghoulies since it was a series called Dracula Pack, also by Hanna-Barbera. This was another variation of an animated take on the Universal monsters, and was about a trio of teenagers who were the descendants of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. In order to make up for the evil acts of their ancestors, they decided to become a group of superheroes and, what else, fight crime. They're helped out by a mentor, and it's actually Count Dracula. And they call him the Big D, which is kind of funny. But wait a minute, one of them is Drac's great-nephew, and he's fighting evil to make up for what Dracula did? Like Drac is there. Make him do it himself. Regardless, it was on CBS, but much like the Ghoulies, it was not a success and only lasted for one season, with 16 episodes in total.
Frankie, Howler, and Drac Jr., the Drac Pack.
So I think that everyone knows about the Teen Wolf TV show on MTV, but before that, there was an animated Teen Wolf that ran in 1986. This was also done by Hanna-Barbera, but done in conjunction with a company called Southern Star. Of course, it's based on the 1985 film of the same name with Michael J. Fox, although the animated version would be quite different. It ran on CBS, but changed the town that the film takes place in to the cartoon town of Wolverton. As opposed to just living with his dad in the movie, the animated guy was given a little sister and a pair of grandparents in the house as well. But the biggest difference is the fact that most of the cartoon episodes revolve around Scott keeping his werewolf identity a secret, something that is public knowledge in the film. It made it for 2 seasons and a total of 21 episodes, and had a shift in production companies in between seasons. And it did run for a 3rd year, but that run was entirely made up of reruns from the first 2.
Teen Wolf coming out to play. Teen Wolf coming out to play.
This next one is a big one, and I'm sure that there's someone that'll say it's not a horror movie, but it's freaking ghosts, so I'm rolling with it because in 1986, we had the premiere of the Real Ghostbusters. It was spun out of the 85 film, Ghostbusters, duh, and it was on ABC. It had to be referred to as the Real Ghostbusters because there was previously a live-action show with that name that was on CBS back in 1975, and they threatened a lawsuit, so they added the Real to the title. Filmation then revived that franchise with an animated show in '86 to compete with this one. The Real Ghostbusters continued out of the first film and could be seen as a sequel, although it's mostly viewed as a companion piece to the film and set in its own universe, mainly due to the presence of Slimer. That was a bit character in the first film and was given full-on sidekick status here, and his popularity led to his inclusion in Ghostbusters 2. It was a massive hit and lasted for 7 seasons and a whopping total of 140 episodes. Over the course of the series, there was a couple of major voice changes, although Venkman's was the most noticeable since he was changed from Lorenzo Music, the voice of Garfield, to Dave Coulier, the guy who Alanis went down on in a theater. There were even several spin-offs, with Slimer getting his own series of shorts, and then a later 1997 series called Extreme Ghostbusters, although that only made it for 1 season.
Who you gonna call?
2 years later, we had one that I didn't know was actually a British series, and it's 1988's Count Duckula, which was sort of a spin-off of Danger Mouse. That show had Duckula appearing as a semi-regular villain, but they thought it would be a fun concept to spin off into its own show. It aired on ITV over there, but was then imported to the US to run on Nickelodeon. It lasted for 4 seasons and had 65 episodes. And I'm calling it inspired by Dracula because, the title. But when he got his own show, he became a good guy character, and they made him a vegetarian. It was pretty popular and ran for the 4 years, and even got his own spin-off with Victor and Hugo, Bunglers in Crime, which took 2 characters named Gaston and Pierre and sort of reinvented them as well into human form. Much later, in 2015, when a reboot of Danger Mouse appeared, the Count was brought back in there as well, returned back to his villainous roots.
Dracula.
spectacular.
The next year, there was another big one, and another, I guess, that you could argue the whole horror thing, but 1989 gave us Beetlejuice, an animated version of the Tim Burton favorite. Burton himself developed it, bringing in the Nelvana animation company. Of course, the cartoon version was mostly different than the film since it altered the characters' relationships. Here, Beetlejuice was the best friend of Lydia Dietz and wasn't trying to marry her. He also was just more of a harmless prankster here and causes wholesome trouble. Plus, Lydia herself was made to a much more upbeat character, far from the goth kid from the film. It was a big hit and ran for 4 seasons, although the first 3 were on ABC, but then it moved to Fox for season 4. But it still ran that season on ABC, making it one of the first animated shows to run on 2 US networks at the same time. There were a total of 109 episodes, and they were fairly acclaimed, and the show even won a Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, even if it tied with The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. There was also a ton of merchandising and such, although, surprisingly, it wasn't revitalized when they brought out the new Beetlejuice. Oh, wait. I almost said it 3 times. The new movie. This is now going to be the streak of weird ones, because in 1990, TV stations were assaulted by the attack of the killer tomatoes. It was an animated show that ran on Fox Kids and spun out of the low-budget horror comedy of the same name. However, by this point, there was a film from 1988 called Return of the Killer Tomatoes. That one was wackier and more cartoonish, so I suppose that translated to, let's show this to kids. It follows up from the Return storyline, bringing over several of the characters from that one, including the wacky comic relief FT, Fuzzy Tomato, that was literally a little fuzzy tomato that they just told people was a dog. But the reason why they chose this franchise is pretty funny. There was an episode of the Muppet Babies TV show in which Fozzie had a dream in which he was fighting killer tomatoes, and they used clips from the original film. That episode was weirdly popular and had some of the highest ratings of the season, so they decided to go forward with making it its own cartoon series. It's somewhat notable because the second season of the show had segments that incorporated computer animation and is stated to be the first Saturday morning show to do so. It lasted for 2 seasons, although the second season was only 8 episodes, so the show only had 21 episodes in total. 1 year later, things got more inappropriate with 1991's insanely confusing decision, Toxic Crusaders, based on The Toxic Avenger, an extremely violent and sex-filled feature film. Although, by this point, parts 2 and 3 had come out, which shifted towards a more cartoonish level of those things and less realistic violence. But, by this point, there were already cartoons about RoboCop, Rambo, and Police Academy, so the idea of taking something R-rated and making it for kids wasn't out of the ordinary. It altered the storyline of the films quite a bit, although it picked up some threads from the sequels in changing Melvin's last name from Ferd to Junko and having his girlfriend be Claire instead of Sarah. Since there was a trend at the time to do environmentally conscious cartoons, this one followed suit and had Toxie team up with a crew of other radiation-enhanced heroes and his sentient mop to fight against polluters. It only made it for 1 season, and there's only 13 episodes, but because of its source, it's taken on a distinct cult notoriety, and even had a short-lived toy line.
Wow! Toxic Crusaders, Toxic Crusaders, Toxic!
That same year, there was another odd one with Little Shop, a series that ran on Fox Kids and was based on the classic Little Shop of Horrors, although it's likely more based on the '86 musical than the 1960 Roger Corman flick. The cartoon was radically different than any other version though, since there's no Audrey 2, and instead the plant is named Junior and doesn't eat people. In fact, it's not even an alien here, and is instead a prehistoric plant form that had been dormant for millions of years. It did eat all the time though, and it does have human blood, although they don't show that in the show, and they only just mention it. Also, Audrey is Mr. Mushnick's daughter, and there's no Orange Scrivello, and he's replaced by a different psychodentist named Pain Driller. This one also only lasted one season and also only had 13 episodes, and didn't really have as much cult remembrance afterwards.
I wanna go to the little shop. Word, little shop.
91 was chock full of animated horror stuff, and again, this one might toe that line, but it's Swamp Thing. Much like Toxic Crusaders, it's an environmentally based series with Swampy facing down the forces that want to pollute the world. And it's based on the DC horror superhero that had a run of popularity around this time. He had a couple of feature films and a live-action show that ran for several seasons, so it seemed like the perfect property for an animated spin-off. This was Canadian and ran on YTV up there, and was by Deke, and again leaned far more into the superhero part of the character than the horror aspects. It's known for its bizarre opening theme song, which is a variation on the song Wild Thing, although instead it's them saying Swamp Thing, which is pretty funny. It was considered a bit of a flop though, and only 5 episodes were ever produced. And even with that though, there was still an action figure line that was made that were said to be more successful in the end than the actual show.
Swamp Thing, you are amazing. You fight everything nasty. Swamp Thing.
1992 had a case of the almost was, since there may have very nearly been a cartoon called Operation Aliens, based on the success of James Cameron's Aliens. It took the Alien franchise and focused on the colonial marines, and made all that stuff more kid-friendly. You see, they had made a toy line based on aliens with a number of marines and different kinds of variants of the xenomorphs, and it's long been said that there was the intentions of having an animated series to go along with it. It's possible though that there never was a series intended and only a set of animated commercials for the toys that were never aired, since the then head of Fox Kids said that it never existed, and that they never wanted to go forward with a pilot. However, she stated that Kenner approached Fox with the idea of a series in order to promote their line, but wasn't sure if the idea was ever actually pitched, and that if they had brought the idea to them, she likely would have turned it down. But there are storyboards, and some say they're simply for the commercials and not an intended pilot, so who knows how far Kenner got with their ideas. One more year later, in 1993, there was another one that you'd probably call a sketchy decision, since we got Tales from the Crypt Keeper on ABC. As you can probably gauge from the title, this was spun out of HBO's popular Tales from the Crypt live-action series and ran at the same time. However, whereas that was clearly an adult show, this was meant for kids. It followed the format of the show, with the Crypt Keeper introducing a segment that was designed to teach a lesson, although these lacked the HBO sex and violence, although it did have characters die just off screen. As the show went on, it got more plot-centric and introduced another EC Comics character, the Vault Keeper, and would then have the Crypt Keeper more involved in the stories themselves. It ran for 3 seasons in total and 39 episodes, although they were fractured. The first 2 seasons were on ABC, but it was then cancelled and took a 5-year break before being brought back in 1999 as new Tales from the Crypt Keeper for one final season on CBS.
Tales from the Crypt Keeper.
In 1994, there was yet another take on the Universal Monsters with a show called Monster Force that was made for syndication. Unlike the earlier tries with the characters in this show, the monsters were the villains, and the Monster Force of the title was a group of teens that were dedicated to fighting them. Much like the Monster Squad, the Frankenstein's monster would defect and help out the forces of good, and the baddies included Dracula, the Wolfman, the creature from the Black Lagoon, The Mummy, and The Bride. Universal produced this themselves and packaged it with another cartoon called Exo Squad. Monster Force wasn't successful though and only got limited airings, getting cancelled after one season of 13 episodes. It did have a toy line though, which also appears to be unsuccessful, with only one line produced. Our next entry doesn't arrive until 1998 with Fox Kids' airing of Godzilla the series, our second entry on the list for the Big G, but also kinda not. This was right after the American version of Godzilla with Matthew Broderick and picks up where that film leaves off. It focuses on the egg that hatches at the end of the film and one of the baby Godzilla, although this one is far less destructive and imprints on the character of Nick to become loyal to him. They then fight a bunch of other strange monsters and mutants. And I guess you could say maybe that this series was slightly more popular than the film that it spawned from, since it made it to 2 seasons for a total of 40 episodes, although there are 2 that never saw air, but have since been released in DVD collections. It had a rocky airing schedule since there was this big showdown between Pokemon on Kids WB and Digimon on Fox Kids, and they were airing those as much as possible, and they had to bend G's schedule around multiple airings of them, which made it get bumped on occasion, leading to those 2 episodes not airing. Speaking of big monsters getting another chance, in 2000 there was another go at the king with Kong, the animated series, and was another one that was made for syndication. This was before the Peter Jackson revamp of the character, and was said to be based on the 33 version of Kong, and involved them making a clone of that guy using DNA from his downed body. In modern times, they have a full-size Kong and go on adventures to find things called the Primal Stones in order to save the world. They actually made this one to compete with Godzilla the series, so I guess Kong vs. Godzilla will just always be a thing, and it made it for 2 seasons and lasted 40 episodes. Fox Kids aired it for half a season before pulling it though, with it lasting the full 2 seasons in other countries. Later, when the remake was released, they would bring it back in a set of 2 feature films called Kong, King of Atlantis, and Kong, Return to the Jungle, with the latter one being fully computer animated. This next one was just a year later in 2001, and this is another one that probably shouldn't be on here because it's not horror, but it did have giant monsters in it, and this is Alienators, Evolution Continues. This was a continuation of the 2001 film by Ivan Reitman that felt a bit like a Ghostbusters clone called Evolution, and the cartoon ran on Fox Kids. It would basically just be an actual sequel to the film and picked up where it left off. Included a Slimer-like character that looked like the smiley face featured in the film's logo. It only lasted for 1 season and was a bit longer with 26 episodes, and it had a video game spin-off.
This hero team has got control of the scene. Evolution.
It looks like we're not done with versions of Universal Monsters because in 2001 there was also The Mummy, the animated series. Unlike the other entries here, this focused on a single member of the crew and was a direct spin-off of a film as opposed to being just a general Universal Monsters thing. This was based on a '99 film with Brendan Fraser and picks up after the second film and can be taken as an alternate sequel since the events differ from what would eventually be shown in the third Mummy film. It ran on Kids WB and focused on the family trying to find a way to remove the manacle of Osiris from little Alex's wrist, much like the second film. It made it for 2 seasons, but in the second season they revamped the show and retitled it to The Mummy, Secrets of the Magi, where the sect would then teach Alex to fight the mummy, which was a returned Imhotep causing them trouble. However, it failed to click and was cancelled after that second season for a total of 26 episodes. We're going to fast forward now all the way to 2023, and our final entry here is Gremlins: Secrets of the Mogwai. It was made exclusively to stream on HBO Max and was based on Gremlins, of course. It was made as a prequel to the films and takes place when Wing, the old man from the movies, is just a young boy in China, and details how the two met. So far, it's run for 2 seasons. It's had 15 episodes, although as I'm writing this, the final 5 episodes have not yet been launched. It had a handful of connections to the films, with Joe Dante acting as a consultant and Zach Galligan appearing as a voice actor. It's been critically acclaimed and has done pretty well, getting nominated for several awards. So there you have it, a history of the animated series that have been based on horror or kind of horror-ish properties. Let me know which of these that I've missed. Let me know if there's any that I don't have in this roster, because I think I got them all, but it's kind of hard to tell. There's a lot out there. I watched a bunch of these when they were on. Some of them I didn't. Some of these were a little bit after my time, but I definitely watched quite a few of them, especially some of the earlier ones. I remember those being on and getting a kick out of them. I remember for some reason having a big fascination with Dracula Pack. That one sticks out in my head as like something that stuck with me for some reason. But yeah, let me know which of these you've seen. Tell me that down below. If you liked this video, something a little bit different, hit that like button. If you like what you see on the channel, of course, subscribe to it. And check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support me and help keep this channel going. I appreciate that, and I also appreciate you just coming back and watching. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you very shortly for another great video.